I'm Angelo Robles, a Family Office TV, and of course, Family Office Masterclass. I know I've said this before, and I really mean it all the time, but today, I especially mean it. I have a very, very special guest, a return guest. Although he hasn't been on a live yet, this summer, if you go to my Family Office TV on YouTube, you'll see a very long form interview that I did with a very accomplished gentleman. His name is Burlingame. I highly recommend, after, of course, you stay with us for this long form interview now, that you also go to my Family Office TV. Of course, you should be subscribed already, but if you're not, you will. And then, of course, you'll watch the interview I did really just a couple of months ago. But things are happening so quickly in geopolitics, in the economy, really in everything, that 3 months ago does kind of feel like forever ago. So some of you were with me on my live broadcast on Saturday. I kind of set the stage a little bit with velocity of destruction. So our special guest today interplays so well into one of my core masterclasses that I created, which is sovereign risk and disaster preparedness for family offices. Honestly, a subject that no one is really honestly talking about in the community, or certainly not in any long form and without any true knowledge. Yeah, you may, as a family office, get some context from a geopolitical thinker at a bank that you bank in, and I'm sure they're smart and there's something to learn. But you don't think that's coming with any conflicts? Then I don't know what to say. So I'm really honored, and it's a special opportunity to have our discussion today, geopolitical threats and actionable. That's going to be different from this summer. Actionable risk mitigation strategies for families, family offices. This will be a long form interview. This is not some light 20 or 30 minutes. You're going to learn a lot, and it's going to be very impactful. Our special guest today is the return of Burlingame, former Green Beret, irregular and unconventional warfare thinker and author, startup founder, and former investment analyst and technologist. Welcome back to the show. I don't think I heard you.
Oh, good to be here. Apologies.
Okay, there you go. Let's get right to it. We're facing what I could argue is the most threatening geopolitical situation since World War II, coupled, and this is the challenge especially, while simultaneously being in the weakest fiscal position that we've been in decades. That's a tough combo.
Yeah, I can't argue. I think geopolitically we're late 1930s. The only difference is we now have nuclear war weapons and biological weapons and targeted energy weapons and a vastly more connected world, particularly at the financial level, that's been decoupling the last 18 months than we ever had before. With respect to the fiscal problems, I don't think we've ever been in this place before. At least the United States has not. Maybe some other former European empires were, and other empires. I would add one further thing, risk factor, primary risk factor, and uncertainty factor, and that is the social division, the internal threat that we have now, the instability that we've gone through rough times as Americans, but nothing quite like this.
And again, as I noted, I had you on a couple of months ago. We didn't get too much into solutions, and solutions are complex and very individual and relative, somewhat related, somewhat to opinion, but I think they're important. But we've also had further developments in Russia to Ukraine, further developments and challenges here internally with our political system here in the US. And of course, I'd be beyond remiss if I didn't mention escalations in the Middle East. So really, just in the last week or so, a lot of this has gotten much, much more challenging and threatening, and what some would argue feels like it's the beginning, potentially, of World War III. So, I look at this as many family offices are finding that their assumptions and strategies may not hold up in the face of crisis or profound shifts. How would you talk about I guess, a broad question with everything that I mentioned going on, and we have a long way to go in this conversation. How could families think and their family offices about exactly that? In the face of crisis, we're undergoing a profound shift. How are they going to be adaptable? How are they going to go from being reactive to being adaptive in their strategies?
Yeah, so actually a very good question. A somewhat not simple but not complex answer. You have to know, as we say in special operations and in investing, investment banking, private equity, you need to know how to read the market. You need to have situational awareness. And primary to that, in where we are today, primarily in the West, is we have to, as a family office, let's keep focused there. What you have to understand is that at all times in administrative bureaucratic systems, and even in families, there are always at least three powerful factions. And two of those factions, in terms of the administrative world, the world of the managerial class, as some people say, one of those factions is fascist in its mindset in terms of total and absolute control sought. The other is Marxist communist, and it wants to destroy and remake. And then you have loosely what I call the responsibles faction. And those are the ones that want to, hey, keep things going. We've made progress. We've made mistakes. Let's kind of figure that out, but let's keep things going. And let's keep the fascist folks, as we call them over the last century or so, from taking control of everything and turning on a whole bunch of people. And let's keep the Marxist communist, as we've known them over the last 150, 160 years, from destroying everything and harming a lot of people. So specifically to your question, we have to understand that there are three factions at play. Two of them are always there. The responsibles faction is only loosely coming together right now and kind of getting themselves organized. And that gives you the framing for how you assess what is coming across from your advisors, your gatekeepers, from consultants, and more importantly, the news, quote unquote news, because I'm not sure we can trust any of the news anymore. But, your information flows that are coming in, you need to be able to assess all of that, realizing that there are three factions locked in all-out war everywhere, in cities, in corporations, in the federal government, state governments, internationally. These three, four factions are at all-out conflict. It's hot conflict in a few areas, but it's, hot conflict, to be honest, is only about 1% of war. 99% of war, even in a designated war, is all the Cold Warfare stuff.
If you don't mind, if you could repeat the three factions again, because I'm going to have some specific questions.
Yeah, so I use these labels loosely, except for the responsibles one. I use that. But there's two resentful factions as we've known them over the last century. It's the fascist Nazis, straight up, but really fascist. And the other faction is the communist Marxist. And that's for like 100 and some odd years. And then there's the responsibles, which is people who are fairly good people, oligarchs mostly, and folks who support oligarchs who are trying to sustain and keep things going while fixing some problems, because we do have some serious structural problems.
I've heard scholars mention the verbiage, also using the word factions as resentfuls. How would you bucket them?
Yeah, so that's, I think I started this here. There's the two resentfuls factions are the communist and the fascist. And the they don't differ in their goals. They don't differ in the fact that they are administrative systems. Where they differ is in what their end state is. One wants homogeneity and purity and wants to control all of the levers of power and wealth creation, blaming everything on ethnic groups, people, the very things that we saw in World War II. The other one, the communists, the Marxist ones, they want to control and destroy everything because they want to remake it in their utopian ideal. What winds up happening when you pursue utopia, always, and I say this as somebody who spent 8 years of his young life on a hippie commune, and I got to see utopians up close and personal. The only way you can get to utopian ideal is to kill everybody. The same thing with the fascists. The only way to get to absolute control so you can have your perfectly functioning system is to kill a whole bunch of people.
There are some people that would say, so could I make the argument, if I stay with that verbiage of three different factions, that there's various, I don't know if I'd use the word industries, but governments, banking, finance, media, that one or the other faction at various times in history has varying degrees of control.
Yes.
And that applies specifically to governments. We hear a lot about what's going on even at the World Economic Forum and the perspective of there's some people that claim, and I don't know, I'm not knowledgeable enough, that the world is overpopulated, this and that there could be shortages of food and droughts. Is that somewhat of an attempt that the world is too populated?
It's a justification for genocide. Whether it's a sophisticated or an unsophisticated genocide, it's sophistication for genocide and the theft of assets. Because if you look at the actual numbers, there's a great book called Unpopulated. If you look at the actual numbers, populations are collapsing. And that's actually the real problem. The real problem is that since the 1600s, and really going back to the 12 and 1300s, when the modern banking-ish system and actuarial tables and risk modeling and all that really began, a certain demographic growth rate over a 50 and 100-year period is absolutely necessary for the entire system to work. So when like we've been doing since the fall of the Berlin Wall, we've been racking up unsustainable debts based off of fraud and corruption, but also probably mostly off of false assumptions about how economies work. The fundamental of all economic systems is it needs growth, and growth is people, it's consumers, it's financial consumers, right? So goods and financial services. So you need a certain number of people graduating from schools or going out into the workforce, buying houses at certain ages, cars at a certain age, and investing in certain asset classes at certain ages. You need all of that as a base of the economy. And you can't make that up with a rent-based system, et cetera. So population decline is our biggest problem. And we've known it for quite some time, actually. Anybody who's serious about it, the arguments for population reduction, et cetera, is literally just to justify genocide and to do two things. One, erase or greatly reduce the liability side of the ledger, while also taking as many assets as possible to plus up your investment failures and losses, et cetera. And particularly the administrative state, to keep its payroll, promotions, and pensions going.
When I look at what I could argue is a world in chaos, and really a small sampling is war, inept governments, inflation, banking crisis, dollar here in the US losing status and the impact on the world, potential derivatives collapse, confiscatory governments. I mean, it's endless. I would say that money and legacy of a family continuity, a word that I love, or words, family continuity, are absolutely not safe generationally. Now, we're jumping the gun in terms of getting into some things that they could do. we do need to build a little bit more of the narrative and the story first. But in terms of setting that stage, so much to talk about. But I did mention effectively what's power distribution. So kind of make the point, Russia and Ukraine, and Russia being a part of BRICS, and certainly the threat, especially of China and Russia, but especially one of the other BRICS is also a huge powerhouse, and that's India, that the opportunity of them coming together and forming an alternative currency or a transactional system away from the dollar, impacting dollar hegemony, however you want to pronounce it, is a massive threat. And the US and or its three-letter agencies directly and indirectly, probably since Bretton Woods, just will not allow that to happen. But when is that inevitable, that there will be an alternative? If not necessarily the world's reserve currency, but the chassis, the transactional challenges and issues about how that's carried out, is it all changing before our eyes?
I would say it already has. It already has. It's not an inevitability. It's here. The threat is not the rise of a non-nation state or non-currency monopolized global transaction system. That's not the threat. The threat is the agency and other people who are trying, in all ways possible to include wars everywhere and regime changes everywhere to hold on to the Bretton Woods system. The Bretton Woods system was done in 1992. It was over when the Soviet Empire capitulated and started its rough years. The Bretton Woods Accords, basically their purpose was over. The debts that we had been taking on, particularly accelerating in the late 70s into the 80s under Thatcher and Reagan, those debts, that debt field system was supposed to be turned off. We didn't turn it off. We amped it up steadily, particularly through the last 20 years of the GWAT, and then COVID, et cetera. The real threat is not an alternative financial system that's based off of commodities primarily, and that is not based off of a single currency, but is an actual transaction system where the banks get back to what banks used to do, and that is handle all of the complexities of multi-currency transactions and valuation, et cetera, and trust. The real threat is those that are trying to hold on to this old system that's long dead and gone and is so over bankrupt, it's ludicrous. I mean, it can never be repaid. That's where the real threat. So I'm not threatened by Russia. I'm not threatened by China. What I am threatened by is that they're building sound, stable financial systems. Now, China's cleaning up some very serious mess, and it has some very, tens of trillions of dollars of mess that it has to clean up. And it has been doing that over the last 3 to 4 years. I believe China will come out of this, but China and Russia and BRICS are not a threat to us. The threat to us is all the capital controls that our own system is putting in place so that family offices and just smart citizens can't put their capital to work in one of those solid or more. They can't take their capital out of the US system or the Eurodollar system, as Jeff Snyder would call it. And I think he's probably right in his articulation.
Let's dive a little bit into that. So kind of, I believe what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that many US big families and investors, US citizens in general, and perhaps Western citizens in general, we're extremely tied into the US dollar, as that potentially has challenges, no matter how you define it, that could cause a decline given our deficit, the issue of other countries being less inclined to buy treasuries. And this creates a cycle that we kind of can't, like you said, at $33 trillion and growing, how are we going to get out of? So if you're a significant family, a family office, and 99% of your resources are tied into the dollar, whether it be treasuries, cash, stocks, which probably are more US-based companies, real estate, etc., what is a solution? Do you simply have multiple currency plays? Do you own offshore business interest in real estate? What are some, I mean, I guess we're jumping the gun a little bit to some solutions, but what are some things that families could do if they're concerned, about the issues that you're describing?
Yeah, well, first off, I would recommend they look at some experts who are way more expert on that, that very question than I am, and I'm sure you know some of them. What I would do first is I would get a much better understanding of how the Eurodollar system works and has worked since Bretton Woods, but really has also morphed and adapted post Cold War. So right now we're looking at somewhere between $4 and $5 quadrillion in debt, total public, private, and derivatives markets.
You said quadrillion.
Quadrillion. And to put that in context, if you paid back $1 per second, it would take you 33 million years for 1 quadrillion. Never mind 3 to 5 or 4 to 5. And these are much bigger brained, financial big brain people than I am that are putting these numbers out there. And the truth of it's sneaking out as well. So as a family office, I can't give you specific advice because your portfolio, your investment strategies, your the complexity of your office and your family and your needs are unique to you and have to be addressed that way. What I can say across all the family offices is that somebody in the family office with the ear of the principal or principals needs to get really smart, really quick on how the Eurodollar system and the Euro banking, U.S. Euro banking system works. Because we don't actually most people really don't understand that, and they don't understand the interdependencies. They don't understand the leverage. They don't understand how bad the problem really is. And this, Dalio touches on this. Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett touch on it. This isn't just Ian Burlingame saying this. And there are some really smart people. Jeff Snyder's one of them. George Gammon over at Rebel Capital. There's some things on the Duran every once in a while, Alex Cristoforo and Alex Mercurius. There's some really good knowledge out there. Folks are but I would probably look at Jeff Snyder. He really dials into this and has, been looking at it. So that's the first thing. I would really get an understanding how the Eurodollar system works and has worked and what's coming undone with it. And you can do that actually in a 2-3 day study. The second thing I would look at is to understand from there how much of the valuations of the assets in your portfolio, right down to the real estate that you hold, is based off of derivatives and the artificial valuation pricing that has occurred because of derivatives. So the vast majority of pricing of assets of every class is either artificial and being masked or is dramatically overblown, X multiples overvalued. So what happens when we can't use our military and intelligence to regime change other countries to keep buying our debt, because that's what we've been doing for 40 years. That's what the GWAT really was.
What would make that not happen?
China, Russia, the BRICS, not just as an economic bloc, but the BRICS is very capable peer militaries and intelligence, and in fact, probably even better on the intelligence side than we are anymore. It takes 80% of the world's populace and when combined, much larger economy to say, no, you will not regime change us anymore. No, you will not do a coup in that country. No, we will not keep buying your debt and supporting your illusion and lie. And that's exactly what's happening. It's why we tried to take down Russia. It's why we keep saber rattling against China. China has no interest to invade Taiwan. None. We totally made that up. And we keep selling that lie. And I've worked in Taiwan. I worked for Taiwanese gentlemen from a very elite family. I worked in China as an investment analyst. I've had these conversations, and I got spanked a couple of times because I sold the American story there in China, and it was like, yeah, no, let me have a conversation with you. They have no desire to invade Taiwan. They don't need to. They don't need to. We made that shit up so we can try to go to war, so we can do sanctions. And what are those sanctions? Those sanctions are capital controls, so we can't put money into their system when they get it cleaned up, which is what they're doing right now.
Now, hold on. If what you're saying is the reality, and again, we have massive issues with the deficit. You mentioned, untold pension liabilities, a variety of different challenges. If things get reset from that perspective and valuations drop to what you could argue maybe they should be, that is calamity. That is perhaps craziness with inflation. That is a very, very ugly picture.
Well, here's the one thing that, so give me 1 second. And yes, it is an ugly picture, but it's not unmanageable, right?
It's not
unmanageable. It's a haircut. It's a major, it's a haircut kind of like mine, right? It's not unmanageable. The problem that we have is a massively bloated administrative bureaucratic state that we cannot even begin to afford anymore. And the way in which to deal, so the deficit, $33 trillion, yeah, it seems like a lot of money. It's nothing compared to the $3 to $5 quadrillion. It's nothing. It can be dealt with by substantively downsizing the administrative state. This isn't just in government. This is in corporations. This is in universities. This is in, I live here in San Francisco for another 3 or 4 hours because, that's why I'm not dressed very nicely. I'm packing up and I'm leaving the city, maybe for the last time, which kind of breaks my heart. I love my city. But look around you. Anybody who lives in cities, anybody's in a family office, look around you at all of the make work jobs. Now, I get it. We're trying to employ people. That's an important priority. But look at all of the make work jobs. The only way we get through this is the make work jobs go away. And then what do you do with those people? Because you don't want to dump them all on the street, and you don't want to destroy their lives, et cetera. So there has to be subtle, early retirements and partial retirements and a whole lot of sophisticated stuff we got to do. But we have to dramatically downsize the administrative bureaucratic state, and they will not let you do that peacefully.
Is what you just described, I'm going to cut to the chase a little bit. Is that the single biggest threat to family offices?
Yes, by far. Because it fuels everything. And think of it on just a single point level. Where do you get most of your information about what's going on in the world, and what's going on locally, and what's going on in the economy? From the administrative state. Where do you get most of your information on your safety and security? From the administrative state. What happens if you have to downsize the administrative state to keep the economy going at all? Are they going to give you the truth?
No.
They're going to do one thing. They're going to go to war. And they're either going to go to war internationally with everybody that they can to justify and keep themselves in positions of employment, keep their payroll, promotions, and pensions, and put the country on wartime economic footing, or they're going to go to war against you.
What you're describing, I used a word earlier, it's called chaos, a world in chaos.
Chaos isn't sufficient anymore. The problem is that we've been doing chaos for 20 years. It wasn't sufficient to the task. You need a war for 2 reasons. One, it justifies the continuation and expansion and growth in the administrative state. Second, it kicks in force majeure clause. All contracts in Western contract law have a force majeure clause, and allows you to kick in force majeure clause and abrogate hundreds of millions of contracts, which are all these obligations are based on. and you remove a massive amount on the liability side. Now you're going to take a hit on valuations, and I don't think there's anything that can stop that. There's, again, people way smarter than me on those topics talking that. I think you're going to see, and this is something family offices really have to look at, you're going to see dramatic reductions in asset values. I don't think across the board, and it's not going to happen all at once. These things are complex interdependencies, but asset values will have to start coming back down closer to realistic numbers. And then you ask yourself, okay, how much of my standard of living is based off of my ability to borrow within certain rates against certain assets that are valued at a certain amount? How much of the administrative state is supported by assets that are of a certain value that get taxed at a certain rate, right? There's all of these dependencies, but depreciation of asset values, I mean, like 40% of companies in the S&P are zombie companies. Their valuation is only based off of how much money they've been able to borrow over the last 4 or 5 years.
Because the money was cheap until recently?
Because we had basically, for all intents and purposes, negative interest rates.
And everyone, in case you're wondering, these are things that Howard Marks has recently spoken about as well, Jeffrey Gundlach. I mean, these are big name, iconic, not only billionaires, but people in finance, you could argue, kind of in the know, and they've been talking about this. Now, could I make the point, and boy, this is very amateurish, but if everything comes down 40, 50, 60, 70%, then to some degree, is that all relative? Do I go from being worth $1 billion to being worth 200 million, but my 200 million as a percentage is still greater as it was when I was $1 billion, because everyone basically dropped down?
Yeah, so good question. I think this is what I've seen in other families, and I've had 2 billionaire family friends, colleagues, and one's a very good friend, get taken down in the last few years. And it turned out it wasn't the amount, when you do a Google search, somebody's net worth is this. Turned out that really doesn't matter much. What matters is how much of your standard of living and the jobs and all the people that you employ are based off of revenues. And what are those revenues based off of, right? Because you got artificial valuations and companies borrowing, et cetera. But how much of your ability to sustain your standard of living and pay all the people that work for you is based off of baseline revenues? And the second part is off of lending, right? Borrowing that you're able to do against assets to keep all of that going. And when there is a marked depreciation in assets, it doesn't necessarily, it doesn't matter if you're worth $200 million and 80% of your wealth is in revenue generating and quick loans or whatever. It doesn't matter if you go down to $20 million and your ratios stay the same.
Right.
But most cases they don't. It's the same with billions. You can have 100 billion, 200, 300, 400 billion dollars. If you go down to 100 billion, but you're still sound in terms of, revenues to borrowing to assets, you're not relying too much on artificial assets, or you have assets that have real value, the sustainable value, or which can take a hit to the valuation, but are going to reclimb as the engine restarts, which it will at some point, right? Then you're going to be okay. But what I find, having talked to quite a number of families, and when I was an analyst, both financial analyst and, strangely enough, an intel analyst doing targeting, looking at threat finance networks, et cetera, is that most family officers are way more leveraged than they realize, because so many of the revenues that come in to them are from purely financial system, and or from assets or other companies, clients, consumers, whatever, who themselves are way over leveraged and way overvalued. So the problem is it isn't a straight line either. It's going to work itself out, family office by family office, portfolio by portfolio. It hits different sectors at different times in different ways. I was doing oils futures last year, and it's 6:07 in the morning Pacific time, so 9:07 in the morning. I think it was in November, and algorithmic information bomb just hit the markets, and they went up and down in price at the same time, which is impossible. And you're watching, the options market to see if there's manipulation going on there, and this wasn't coming from there. So somebody hit the market with an information bomb to throw all the algos off. Well, the same thing happens when depreciation starts. It doesn't hit everything all at once. It's this noisy, complex, chaotic space that every family office has to deal with differently. Now, here's the major issue. The primary issue is a bloated bureaucratic state that doesn't care what the hell's going on in your portfolio. They don't care what's going on in your family. They want to keep getting their payroll, promotions, and pensions. And they will do whatever they have to do, including lawfare, right? Like this guy out in New York who just basically had his property seized for a fraction of what it's actually worth, right? Mm-hmm. So don't think for a second the bureaucratic state is your friend, the administrative state is your friend, or that you own them. You don't. And they've got those three factions inside as well. So that's where the information and reputation warfare comes, because they can't just seize. They've got to reputation destroy. They got to do information warfare against you, around you, to set up the legal cases, to give them at least the illusion of validity in what they're doing against you. And in terms of your trust structures and everything else, they can just stroke with a pen or legal action undo any of that. Now, there's some limitations. What's that?
Oh, 100%. I've been talking about that, even real estate titling and other situations, for a number of years. Those around the world in certain countries absolutely know that happens. Supposedly, we might have our head in the sand to reality in terms of here in the US. If what you're saying is true, and it was very articulate, in your opinion, in terms of what is the biggest threat, what could someone do about it? And I'm going to state a comment. It's probably not realistic, but it could weave into maybe how you could respond. There are no statues dedicated to committees. It's to individuals, people that could do amazing things, even though we didn't maybe know it at the time or didn't even think we had it in us. What could even an individual, even one that's a multi-billionaire, even one that's worth hundreds of billions on paper, what could one person do? But on the other hand, there is no soft landing here.
There's no avoiding. I can't say, again, similar to response to the earlier question, I can't say what any principal in a given family office should do, because there isn't a blanket statement again. What I would say is we've attained, and there's a brilliant French economist, Piketty, I think's his name, and he wrote On Capital, and brilliant assessment of the economics and economic wealth distributions over the last couple hundred years. Absolutely brilliant. His numbers are spot on. Math is spot on. Now, being a socialist Frenchman, his prescriptions as to what to do, I think, are ludicrous. But his proscription of what the problem is and what's going on, spot on. Very brilliant. We are at 17th century wealth disparity right now. As this debt of $4 to $5 quadrillion starts getting dealt with, however that happens, we will go to 12th century wealth disparity probably in our lifetimes. What is that? That is all out oligarchy. And what is oligarchy? It's aristocracy. When you talk about multifamily wealth tied up in various structures, that's aristocracy. we learned a lot, and which, by the way, is the oldest, by far oldest and most stable structure of governance, leadership, organization of resources, leadership of resource utilization, etc. There is a vast body of knowledge and experience earned from thousands of years of oligarchy, of aristocracy, feudalism, etc. Much of which shouldn't be thrown away, some of which needed to dramatically upgrade, etc. But the point being is this: no family office at this time can provide for itself a whole lot of things that oligarchic, aristocratic families have had to for thousands of years. And you need to start figuring that out. Because your administrative state, one, cannot provide them anymore because it's way beyond bankrupt. And two, may or may not, at the local, state, and national level, become hostile at any moment.
A couple of things. And by the way, our live audience, feel free to interact. This is a live broadcast on multiple of my social media platforms. You are able to DM questions into the stream, and I'm able to read them. So I'm more than happy to engage your questions as well. That brings up, I guess, my next interrelated question. Most significant families, playing in my world, would have a single family office. You have dealt with some single family offices. Do you think they have the capacity and the capability of assessing the risk that you're describing and having some forms of hedging and continuity within the family? Effectively, are they capable?
What a loaded question.
Of course it is. It'll get us
The
both in
last
trouble.
part of it, are they capable? Some are, some aren't. There is one weakness that they all share, however, and that is that they're most all, in fact, everyone I've talked to, their current advisors and gatekeepers are masters of the old system that, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist anymore. And sure as hell can't survive the next 10, 15, 20 years.
Do too many gatekeepers look to gatekeep the world from their principles?
I think that, well, I know what happens. I've run across that. I don't know that, I've only seen malice a couple times involved in that. Generally, it's either incompetence, and there's a lot more of that in the world than we realize as gatekeepers, because when you had cheap money, which we have for the last 40 years, you can excuse a lot of incompetence amongst your supporters and advisors, and that's got to go away. So part of it's incompetence. A lot of it, however, is very smart, very capable, very dedicated people who, excuse me, who work very hard in their lives to master the information space that they needed to master for the people that they support. And unfortunately, that world has gone away. Excuse me. But once you've tuned yourself to that, it's almost impossible to retune yourself. And it sure as hell isn't time to retune yourself in the crisis.
A little bit of the bigger picture question again, relative to some things that you said. If I look over the last couple of 100 years, and this is not all of them, but some of them, what I would call revolutions, broadly speaking, 1620s English Reformation, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, Nazi Germany. And again, yes, I know what I do. It's representing and being active in the world of single family offices, the richest of the rich, that are hopefully benefiting society. Let's save that discussion for a bit of a different time. But the big picture point is what happened in all those four that I mentioned. Unless you were a royal, could I make the argument that their wealth, a nice word, was kind of wiped out?
Even the royals had their wealth wiped out different times.
You could say that it was seized. You could say that they were eliminated. Again, I'm trying to use nice words, but I think you know what I mean.
Yeah, a whole complex weave of things. Today, Sorry, sinuses. I came back from Spain with a nice little cough. We do it way more complex and sophisticated now. There's a great little book called Fifth Generation Warfare, little primer, General Flynn and Sergeant Cutler. We wage war against our elites in way more sophisticated ways than we did 400 years ago with the British, 300 years ago with the French, etc. So now there's an information and reputation warfare waged against the family office, and then we try to use banks and the courts in concert and financial institutions to take that family down.
You talk about information warfare. I think that's moderately straightforward. There's other forms of warfare, I guess you could argue. One of them is reputation. How does that interplay with information warfare?
Yeah, so excuse me, two primary purposes of information warfare. One is to drive someone to act in a way that you want them to act. And the other one is to set up information out there in the space, and that's to get them to make decisions that support what you're doing. The other one is to release information out there so that later when you move against these people, there's a plausible trail of information to give your arguments that you're making to vilify and bring them down, at least some imprimatur of validity. And then that leads to the reputation. Once you've got that, now you can do reputation warfare, and that's smearing. And there's a great little graphic out there called the disinformation kill chain, and people can look that up. But that's really what it's about. You have to set what we call intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You've got to set the conditions prior through research of your target. You set the conditions prior. So you do your research, then you figure out how to seed the informational environment. You figure out how to pull the informational environment to get the information you need to put your campaign together. And then you seed the information environment, and then you move after the target. And during the movement after the target, that's when the reputation warfare is at its highest.
I think
and then you got to protect yourself on the other side. Once you harm the target, then you got to also continue your information warfare to cover what you've been doing so that they can't recover. Yeah, I apologize. I didn't mean to step on your.
No, it's important that you finish your points. Don't worry about it. Could I consider freedom of movement? That's more than just a lockdown during something like COVID. I'm going to call that where you don't have control of your assets. They could be seized legally or otherwise. Therefore, you could be a wealthy individual family, and now, depending on various charges, various opportunities to take, quote unquote, your resources, how are you going to defend yourself, and how would you have freedom of movement? You're in trouble. I was going to use another word. It begins with an F. I think you know what it is.
Yeah, excuse me. People who are very wealthy today, most all of them came from the middle class or the upper class, with some very few exceptions. So freedom of movement is not something they've ever had to think about for one or more generations. But the truth of the matter is, your ability to move freely is your only real asset. Because you can lose everything and rebuild somewhere else if you can get to somewhere else. And ideally, you get to somewhere else with some assets and your health so that you can start building again. The way in which the communists, the way in which the fascists, the Nazis, etc., were able to control the elites until they took them down or co-opted them was by locking them in place. You lock somebody in place, you isolate them. Now you have positive control of them. Now you can go to work turning their local community against them. You can go to work turning the local bureaucracy against them. You can use your information reputation warfare to now go to work on them and isolate, and get your target into a position where they're making bad decisions, but they can't get out.
Now, again, some of the things we're talking about are very individualized depending on the family. And Ian is an expert on these topics. So he does, and we'll get to it at the end, how you could, read his books, maybe engage with him from a consultative perspective. And these topics, and sometimes in conjunction with Ian and others, are a part of participation in my masterclass that many of you are familiar with. One of them, Sovereign Risk and Disaster Preparedness for Family Offices. So, one, we're not just going to give away everything. That really is a complex series of multi-day discussions, and to some degree could be customized, but we're telling you more than basically what you're hearing elsewhere. But would you agree? I think you hinted at it a little bit earlier, and what you just described, I may call a start over fund. But some of that may interplay with trust structures onshore, which will be more limiting, and offshore. And again, we want to leave some of the legal maneuvering customized to the person via a professional, but broadly speaking, the importance of trust structures and an offshore plan.
Yeah, so I can't remember the gentleman's name. I'm horrible with names. I watched a video, I think I sent it to you actually some months ago, about two-tier trust structures and complete trust structures. There's some very sophisticated things out there. Most family offices, while they have a legally sound trust structure, if that's only sound if the judiciary and the administrative state isn't against you, right? If it is, those trust structures can get undone fairly, and it doesn't even have to be done completely legally, right? So I would revisit trust structures. But for me personally, the thing that concerns me most about family offices, and the ones that I've engaged with, and some of them quite large, is this overconfidence in having the money available to do whatever you want. If you need to do something, you're going to be able to afford to do it. The problem is whoever is set against you knows that as well. And the first thing they're going to do is an information or reputation war and get some financial institution or institutions and bank and some judiciary legal systems to at least freeze your assets so that you can't get access to them. And they're going to isolate you. And maybe you got a security team, you ain't going to be able to afford them. Right? So all of these things that give me a second. Back to the British, right, which is my beloved, right, Britain, the English Reformation in the 1620s into 1640s, the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution. Why did these elites get taken out? Because of the same hubris our elites have now, thinking that their wealth and money was going to, one, be assured, and two, was going to get them out and give them that freedom of movement to get to somewhere safe. Sorry, it's not going to happen. Some of you might. Like the one I keep hearing the most that just blows my mind because it's not thought out at all is, well, we got a private jet. You know how easy it is to ground a private jet in the United States? I mean, you just call the government or whatever just calls the local airport and the administrator and say, yeah, that plane's grounded, or no flights in and out of this area. So having freedom of movement, back to your statement, is way more complicated than just having money. It's way more, and you may not even have that money available to you. It's planning, it's forethought, it's okay. We have to think out what happens if we don't have the liquidity, excuse me, available to us and or the local community where we live has been made hostile, or they've moved foreign hostile force, out external forces, excuse me, either in the form of civil unrest or something worse against you. Excuse me. You have to think these things out. And where are you going? So how are you going to get there? Where are you going? What do you need to have when you're there? If you need to have safety and security when you're there, how the hell are you going to support them and their families? Because they're not sure as hell not going to leave without their family, right? And some of your key people. Excuse me. So all of this continuity stuff and this freedom of movement stuff is actually way more complicated, way more complex than people think. Like, I'll give you an example. If you needed somebody to extract you from somewhere because shit had gone bad for you, excuse my language, the going rate is about $25 to $50 million. And you may not have that. And oh, by the way, the people that do that, there's not a whole lot of them in the world. And they can be easily given another contract that takes away from you at a higher price. There's a whole lot of things that high net worth families have just not thought about because they have a blind spot. All of them, almost every single one that I've talked to. And that blind spot is this overconfidence in the administrative state and its benevolence.
Yeah, I mean, 3 areas that I talk about are competency, blind spots, and ego. And that's inevitably the downfall of most families and family offices. Things that I believe could be addressed from a variety of different perspectives, but somehow over time, years, decades, generations, that does have a tendency to erode, which is why the greatest threat to families is not investing or taxation per se important. Really, it's the structure of capacity and capability, leading to competency, identifying blind spots, moving ego aside, and I guess you could say not putting all your eggs in one basket, a diversity from a global perspective. But there's an interesting question that came in from the audience. I'm going to read it. For a family considering setting up a new SFO, given the threats, is it best to outsource most services and you sacrifice privacy and control? Would this make it easier to relocate your SFO offshore?
Yes. However, I would say there's caveats to that.
Indeed.
All families, if they are genuinely concerned about multi-generational wealth for their family, and not just their family, but key leaders as well, because it's not always just the family that are critical to that family's success.
Of course.
If you are going to if you are truly interested in multi-generational wealth for multiple families, you do have to have you have to have a way of thinking. You don't necessarily have to have the expertise in-house in your own family office, but you do have to have the way of thinking, the continuity thinking and planning, organic and native to you and your family. Somebody has to, that is a decision maker.
And again, that also doesn't address what you just mentioned prior in terms of trust structures, onshore and offshore plans. Let's broadly call it an extraction plan that you mentioned before. The cost of that, the freedom of movement, AKA the lack of freedom of movement. Now, again, there's certain things we're not going to talk about in relatively an open broadcast like this. One of them could be strategic location in the US where you could have more optionality in terms of leaving the country, quote unquote, perhaps not needing necessarily air like you described, the capital to do so, your access to the capital to do so. And we didn't even bring up, as the question does ask, setting up a new SFO offshore or resources where? Like, we hear all these things about what's very trendy around the world is going to Singapore, is going to the United Arab Emirates. I enjoy those locales, very talented people, very bright, clean, beautiful, modern, definitely advantages. Do I 100% trust I can name challenges in Singapore, and what a surprise, in the Middle East at the United Arab Emirates, I could name some challenges there. Is there any place to hide? And maybe to the international, and I think you'll disagree, EM, but is the US the safest place, or is it the classic Switzerland?
Yeah, so back to the thinking part, right? The continuity thinking. We have to understand that there is no single solution anymore.
There's not.
Everything's in flux, everything's being broken, and it has to be. So I'm not, bemoaning that. In order to fix, to get to the solution, and we will work through a solution. It's going to be really ugly, and a lot of people are going to die, or it's going to be something in between, or maybe we'll figure it out. But I'm not seeing that. But point is that moving forward, there are no cookie cutter, out of the box solutions for any family. It has to be addressed family by family, family dynamics by family dynamics, as the world fractures and realigns and reassembles itself. And we don't know exactly how that's going to go because of factional warfare, not just here in the US and in Europe, but factional warfare happens in every institution, every organization, every nation state. And all of that's happening right now. So couldn't tell you. Right now, there's some basic fundamentals. You want some wealth in different countries. You want some controls over those wealth outside the family in the other country in a way, with folks and structures that you can trust, because you and your family may not be in a position where you can have any, anything that you have control over is seized, frozen, denied access, whatever the hell it may be. So what has to happen now is what families used to do and still do in parts of the world where they don't have the same structures. And that is, you have a very sophisticated, multi-part, combined and isolated effort strategy in place to preserve yourself. In continuity planning, you got to figure, okay, I need to do planning for steady state, which is, where we are up to civil unrest. You want to do elevated risk and uncertainty, which is civil unrest rising up to civil war. You want to do escalated, which is civil war rising up to a hostile government, whether that's your own or an occupying force. And then you want to do extreme, where you've got a hostile government set against you. And you need to plan and think through all of the pace, primary, alternate, contingency plans within each of those, figure out what the triggers are, figure out what the warning signs are. There's a mass amount of thinking. And I'll give you, as a, former Green Beret targeting guy, trained to go into countries, just a couple of us, even into hostile territories, there's an immense amount of planning and thinking that has to go into even steady state, much less elevated, escalated, and extreme. But there are people who do that, primarily in Tier 1 and other special operations units, and some of the planning stuff in the agencies, et cetera, although less and less there, except for maybe ground branch. So there is a body of people out there who know how to think through this complex space, because that's the operational space they've worked in. But there's not a lot of them, and most of them have no idea about business and wealth and finance continuity. That's even smaller number, although there's some. I mean, I know 3 Green Beret buddies of mine who went to Wharton and got their MBAs in finance and went and worked on Goldman Sachs and other places. So you have to have the way of continuity thinking. Central to continuity thinking is freedom of movement. Central to freedom of movement is assets in different places of different types, with different individuals responsible for those assets and for your getting to and having access to those assets in the event of something going wrong.
And no, everyone, we're not going to have the time, and to some degree in more of a private setting like a consultative or masterclass to talk about certain more in-depth solutions to offshore trust, extraction, opportunities in Bitcoin or gold, drawbacks, physical assets, art, diamonds. It gets complicated. There's not a simple solution. One question kind of came in. I'll adapt it a little bit. Like, do you state hop? That means you're assuming no offshore strategy, staying in the US, where to go. Do you be close to a border to be able to exit potentially? Money talks, quote unquote, to a different country. Do you go to a state that is more rule-esque, that has certain liberties and privacy and sense of community? I don't know, Montana, Wyoming. How would you answer that, EM? There is no one set solution. It is kind of fluid.
It really depends on you and the dynamics of your family office and your family. I will say that I know one billionaire who I've talked, well, I actually didn't get a chance. I talked to his people and we messaged, but he's got like 13 estates around the world, and he just randomly bounces to different places at different times. So he doesn't have a set pattern of movement. Having different locales that you can go to and having something of an irregular pattern of behavior does help, right? Because getting into our patterns and being stationary makes us too easy of a target. Now, where that is and where you go and how you do it and all that, that's really dependent on you, your dynamics. And one of the key dynamics there is how much assets do you have? How accessible are those assets to the administrative state if they decide to move against you? What is your informational space, right? In terms of their being able to mount information or reputational warfare against you. And I would say the key one is, let's say you got 13 different places that you can go to. How does the community in any one of those know you and connect with you personally?
Very important.
Right? Because truth of the matter is, if when it gets down to the ultimate, holy cow, maybe somebody's got to go in and pull you out, or somebody's trying to get to you, people in that local community knowing you and giving a damn about you, and I don't mean just the administrative state, but people, where have you put your money to work in some people in those communities? Do they know you by name? Or, and forgive the term, but I'm going to use it because, again, there's a lot of knowledge here that we need to look to the past for, right? Whole lot of lords in the past, lords and ladies in the past, survived because the people in the communities that they were in knew who they were, gave a damn about them, and helped them either get information in a timely enough manner that they could act on, or actually help them. And this is the biggest problem we have with family offices today, is that most of them put their money into all these nonprofits, which don't help you as a family build relationships with people in communities. It helps that nonprofit build its brand and whatever the hell. I'm not sure nonprofits solve problems, but they do help. Many times they help the problem, actually. But, the point is that the entire way in which you've put your capital to work, even on the social good side of things, hasn't actually benefited you and your family at all, other than a tax credit, if you even take it. Because like my parents, who aren't wealthy people, but it really doesn't, they've maxed out their charitable giving for what they're allowed to write off. And so beyond that, it doesn't really matter. So even that, your charitable giving and the way in which you do charitable giving, because a lot of the people that you want to build relationships don't want a handout. They would like help with a loan. They would like help, maybe with a relationship or something. So this whole concept and idea that our American, particularly oligarchs, have, and unfortunately a lot of the UK now as well, is that we earn the goodwill of the people by giving to charity. No, you don't. Nobody knows who the hell you are. They know about that charity. And oh, by the way, it's not helping anybody in any of the communities in which you live and operate and move directly, connected to you with your name on it.
Yeah. EM, by the way, is dropping bombs. The charitable and foundation angle is one of the approaches. Didn't know we were going to bring it up, so we're giving away some content that is pretty deep. Just sharing a little bit of insight on it is not the same as participating in one of our programs or engaging with us, but that is one of the things that could be heavily impactful. Relative to that, to a degree, and that question about quote unquote state hopping, I believe it was Machiavelli that said something to the effect of, do you really want to be isolated, far away, in a notable, the best house in that county, the best house in that state? You're going to stand out like a sore thumb. You're also not close enough to the information. Are you better off being more low key, being closer to a center of action, maybe looking a little nondescript on the outside, but they don't really know what's on the inside?
Yeah, so I would say that Machiavelli was way more sophisticated in his statements. I've read Machiavelli at 3 different stages of my life. Once again, just a couple of years ago in my mid-50s. And it's very different each time you read it. And now I understand a lot more of what he was saying. And that's not what Machiavelli was saying. Machiavelli is saying, if you are a certain type of prince, then here's the things that are going to come against you. Here's how the other princes are going to work against you. And here's kind of some ideas of how you should conduct yourself, given the type of prince that you are. And so there are some princes that living a more nondescript, low-key life makes sense because of their nature and who they are. There are other princes that living in the ivory tower and pulling that off is best for them in the nature and type of prince that they are in the community and that supports them. So it's really dependent on the individual, the principles of the family office. Now, one key thing to take, right, there's the noblesse oblige, right? This ancient term, the obligation of the nobility. It isn't to be nice all the time. That's the worst thing we can do for most people, actually. The noblesse oblige is the obligation to conduct yourself in such a way that you're benefiting your people directly. And that's the piece that we've lost, because that's what gets you the loyalty in the local communities where you live, where it really matters. Or around the community that you live in. Now, if you're a prince that's more flamboyant, that's more of a public figure, you need to live in the big place, and you need to have, that's part of the nature and style that is part of your success, both with your wealth building and sustainment and in the community. There are other princes that are low-key people who aren't flamboyant, and it's better to live a lower key life, right? Closer to the earth, closer to the people. And there are some that are very cerebral and very erudite, and it's very hard for people to connect with them at all. And so they have to conduct themselves, they have to build relationships in the community in a more careful, select, targeted way, where they're solving using that cerebral capacity to solve complex, help people in and around their communities solve intractable problems. And I don't mean big problems. I'm not talking about, put $250 million into this or 25 million. No, the types of relationships you want, if these people need money help at all, it's probably less than $50,000 or $250,000. And it's probably not a handout. It's probably all kinds of other ways you can do that, right? Like the one family I was with last year, they were working on through their foundation and doing it all proper and et cetera, a whole number of different ways to help people directly through the foundation. One of the ones that I helped talk to them about, and I don't know what they've done with it, was there was a whole lot of farmers around them that didn't need a whole lot of money, but they could use some help with a bank, or they could use some help with refinancing, et cetera, for farm equipment, farmland, inputs, et cetera. And some of it was just better pricing and sourcing, so they could combine. The foundation had a big farm, very big, and they get better pricing, of course. And so, okay, how can you share some of that with some of the smaller farm holders, et cetera? So it's these types of, figuring out what the real problems are and helping solve that some of the cerebral type folks can benefit from. And then it doesn't really matter how they live. Sorry, a little bit more expansive, but that's really what Machiavelli was saying. Machiavelli was saying, if you're this type of prince, this is what you're going to have to do. And if you're this type of prince, this is kind of what you're going to have to do. And he gave examples.
I guess in the military, and it conveyed its way into the consultative community, sometimes defined as the three rings: within view, just out of view, and beyond horizon. How does a family office look at things more tactfully relative to, I guess, being future and forward thinking, which is probably not the strength, no offense, to most family offices. And we address some of these issues in our conversation so far today, especially the latter two, just out of view and beyond horizon. When you're extrapolating, you're, of course, going to be wrong. Sometimes you're not always going to be right. How do you come to that reality? And then how do you know how to adapt at the moment when you're wrong?
Yeah, so that gets back to two things I stated earlier. One, understand everything's factional warfare and understand the factions and understand how the factions are different in different institutions at different levels and be able to see the factional warfare. That's the first one. That's going to help you be able to see just beyond and beyond the horizon. And it's going to also be able to help you see what's right in front of you better. The second one is continuity planning and thinking, and that's putting all of that in the context of, at these four different threat levels, how is that factional warfare playing out? And how do I know the difference when it's transitioning from one state to another state? I don't mean physical states, but, threat state. How do I know it's moving from one threat state to the next threat state? So the primary thing that the family offices can do, particularly now as everything's uncertain, is one, really get a grasp of factional warfare, how it plays out, how to read the information flows, how to recognize the Markovian stuff, right? That's, things that influence things that you can see. You can't see the thing that's doing the influencing, but you can see the thing that's influenced. That's Markov blankets, etc. I'm not saying everybody should get into computational engineering, but the point being is that understand factional warfare, get an ability to see all the flows of information in the context of factional warfare. It'll help you to much better parse information. It'll also much better help you understand the trajectory of the three different factions, which factions more in the dominance in this action or that action. And then you need to be able to take that and put it into a 4-tiered threat structure, and have your triggers that say, okay, this is moved from here to here. We're moving into this next threat structure. This faction's in the dominance. This is what's happening. Here's what we need to do.
A little bit of a transition. I spoke to a family principal today in terms of what's up, what do you look at as being a problem, what are you thinking of, and maybe equally important, what are your peers? And without hesitation, it was not looking to squeeze out a little more from investment return, or I met this great tax attorney. I mean, all things I think are pretty important, but it was right into geopolitics, not even knowing our discussion today, by the way. And I didn't think he really was even that intrigued by some of the subjects, but sure enough, he was. And obviously the big picture, geopolitically, economics, broadly macro, is very, very important. We will transition a little bit into talking about the escalations that are happening in the Middle East. What I will note, and I noted this in an email to many of you relative to a video that I shot on quote unquote sovereign risk areas. Some of these topics are very, very sensitive. It's important that we talk about it, that we maintain an open mind, that we listen to all sides. And really at the end of the day, something I say so frequently, think for yourself. Think for yourself. One more time, because it's just not enough. Think for yourself. So there are things we could talk about that Ian may say that you may totally disagree with. And you might be right. Like, I don't know. My job is to inquire, to ask questions, to listen, to perhaps have less so feedback, but more follow up questions. So, whenever you're talking about these subjects, especially in today's world, they may end up getting a little heated from the parties that are quote unquote watching or viewing. At the end of the day, you kind of hear what you want to hear. And I guess we're all like that. So, it's important to do the best you could to think for yourself and maintain an open mind. But how could we have the kind of conversation that we're having today without addressing the escalation? So, from the outside looking in, it looks like Israel was pretty close to a more cozy relationship, and you could define that otherwise, with Saudi Arabia. There were developments that were occurring that you could argue had a little bit of a positive perspective, and like, boom, like now we're dealing with since the prior Saturday, so we're about 9 days in. What's your take on the matter, and how does this interplay with some of the topics that we're talking about today?
Again, keep in mind factionality, right? And factional warfare. From the warfare perspective, from a full spectrum 7 elements of power perspective, diplomacy, information, military, economics, finance, intelligence, and law enforcement. So an integrated perspective of those. After more than 20 years of war in the Middle East is tired of war. The Islamic world, except for the radicals, is tired of war, which we, the U.S., we've been at war and creating war and conflicts and regime changes all across the Islamic world for more than 20 years. Now, Russia and China are very powerful, very capable, extraordinarily capable. The whole world's tired of war. The Middle East is the easy tinderbox. So if the world wants to calm down, is tired of paying for trillions and tens of trillions of dollars for bloodshed. Russia and China have to step up. Saudi Arabia has to step up. Iran has to step up. All these BRICS have to step up and say, okay, here's a different framework. Here's functional diplomacy that we used to do. Maybe, I don't know. Let's calm all this down. The Palestine, and they were on that path. And love him or hate him, but the last president was a supporter of that. And not to give him a whole lot of credit for it, all those things were happening in the region anyways. He just supported it and said, yes, the U.S. will support whatever you guys work out. Not whatever, but within reason. Lingering problem is the Palestinians. And what do you do with the Palestinians who've been used as a firebrand in a intentionally a wound that was never allowed to heal intentionally? And so the discussions between Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Israel and other players, first and foremost, would be, okay, how are we going to defuse this Palestinian terrorist and violence and hate and rage? Because there can be no peace unless that is dealt with. There are forces that don't want that to happen. We've been supporting the Palestinians, we and others, for quite some time to stay independent so that they can continually be that rage and violence. And I think the Middle East is done with it. And I don't know what happens to the Palestinians now. And I know a good number of Palestinians, and some of them are really good people and very successful people, extraordinarily. but it's not my people. It's not my conflict. It's not my region in the world. And it is something that they all need to work out themselves. Of course, we've got our war hawks and our neocons, or whatever the hell you call them, who want, the administrative state that wants a world war. And we couldn't get the world war in Europe that we wanted with the Russians, because the Russians proved to be way, way too capable and completely incapable of being goaded to go too far or to do the things that we could justify. Nope, that's not the Russian way. And even a perfunctory study of Russians would have shown us that. So, and we haven't been able to stimulate the war against China, and China's been making all the right moves in counter. So we're probably not going to get the Far East war either. So what are we left with? The Middle East. So personally, I know people are thinking it's World War III and all of that, and it might still happen because we have one or more of our factions that want that to happen for different reasons. But I don't think World War III is going to come out of the Middle East. I think the Middle East, with the assistance of Russia and China, are going to work this problem out. And I think we can already see that. Now, it doesn't mean that there won't be some false flag or whatever. Who knows? The folks that want world war, you have no idea the atrocities they will do to get it. But I don't think they're going to. In which case, it doesn't mean there's going to be disruption in oil pricing, isn't going to be disruption in natural gas pricing and availability. I wouldn't want to live in Northern Europe this winter. There's going to be a whole lot of chaos that's created by the conflicts and the realignment and structuring in the region there. But excuse me, I think they're going to work that out. The thing that I'm more concerned with, although it's still a potential for World War III, possible, I think it decreases in likelihood every day. What it appears to me, and some others that I talk to, is that we in the Eurodollar Western system are being isolated, cut off from the rest of the world through our own actions, in order that we are going to be left to deal with our own debt. And who's that debt primarily to? It's our own citizens, because what is debt-based financing? It's taking from the productivity of future generations. And at $4 to $5 quadrillion, we've taken from the next 5 to 7 generations of productivity. So how are we going to deal with that debt? And what is that going to do to our economies when we can't, at the point of a gun, force nations to keep buying our debt and supporting our Eurodollar system? I think that is by far the greatest concern. And tied into that is, what will the administrative bureaucratic state do, given that reality, to ensure that its payroll, promotions, and pensions continue? That's my biggest concern. So I'm not so worried about what's going on in the Middle East. It's horrible tragedy. I'm sorry to see, the suffering of the people, both the Israelis, where I almost grew up, if it was not for the Yom Kippur War. And I have great, empathy for the innocent Palestinian peoples. But it's not our fight. It's something we should have stayed out of a long time ago. It's a 6,000-year-old family feud that, stay out of other people's family feuds. That's their business.
If looking at the world's military powers, it's pretty definitive, I would think, who the big three are: the US, China, and Russia. You could argue 4 and 5, Iran, North Korea, etc. But it's pretty definitive at the top, I would assume. If you had to rank them by military ability and capability, how would you rank those top 3?
Well, I think at this moment, I would put Russia as number 1. I would put US as number 2 and China as number 3, and nobody else matters.
Why Russia at number 1?
Because Russia has spent the last 18 months in real near peer or peer modern warfare, and they've learned an immense amount from it. And they've come out pretty damn well.
Does, on the ability side, hypersonic missiles, mechanical engineering abilities, drones, how does that play into it?
Well, the fact that the Russians are the world's foremost electrical engineers, and electrical engineering is at the heart of most modern kinetic warfare, they're way ahead of us. And they've been the world's preeminent electrical engineers for 30, 40 years, maybe longer in some areas. So that certainly doesn't doesn't hurt. But they also, we poo-pooed their economy because, what was the statement? They're a gas station masquerading as a country. It's ludicrous. The issue is that they didn't financialize everything. They didn't do the derivatives bullshit that we've done that's now got us into such a big problem. Their economy, for the most, and by the way, they're brilliant financially, but for the most part, they kept their economy base reality. And so their ability to manufacture, to produce, and they've got 25 to 30% of the world's raw materials right there at home. And they're a defensive people. Russia's never been an expeditionary people except for under the Soviets. Russia's been invaded so many damn times. Excuse me. They're just extraordinarily capable. And they just spent the last 18 months at war with all of NATO in Ukraine. And they've learned an immense amount, made extraordinary improvements. Now, it doesn't mean that the United States, if we openly went to war, wouldn't get across that learning curve. But I don't think the United States right now could win a major war. And in fact, it's not just me saying that. It's a whole lot of senior people and people with my background and even bigger backgrounds than I've done.
Is the U.S. military too woke?
Woke's part of the problem. Part of the problem is that we're antiquated. The real problem is that over the last 70 years, we've been beating up little brown and yellow people around the world. Forgive the term, forgive the phrase, but in reality, that's what we've been doing. We've been bullying smaller, weaker people. And oh, by the way, they've been winning. The Vietnamese won. The Afghans won. The Iraqis didn't win, but they're, we sure as hell didn't get what we were looking for, what we were saying we were looking for, which what we were really looking for is just spending a ton of money. So, Mud Hut and Jungle Peoples kicked the living shit out of us. They fought us for 20 some odd years each. So what the hell has the U.S. military done? Oh, by the way, we didn't win World War II either. Now, we backed the Russians, but the Soviets, the Russian peoples, won World War II at the cost of 29 to 39 million of their people. We came in late. So I don't know that our military has ever been quite what we say it is. It doesn't mean it hasn't been quite capable, particularly our Navy, when our Navy was healthy, but our Navy's gone totally off the rails. But when our Navy was good and we were a naval power, right, having learned from our parents, the British, we were quite capable. China's issue.
We have the most nuclear submarines.
Yeah, who cares? Who cares? The honest truth is this: there's no such thing as a tactical or a one-off nuke. Mutually assured destruction states in every country that if one nuke is used somewhere, all nukes are used at once, immediately.
Well, then the world's done.
Then the world's done. That's the whole point of MAD. There is no restraint. When somebody breaks the seal on using a nuke today, now that there are multiple nuclear powers, all nukes go off. Everybody dies. Now, maybe that's a slight exaggeration, but most people do. If they don't immediately, they do over the next 20 years. So this is another thing we have to take into consideration. We, as the United States, our administrative state is trying to get a world war. They're pushing mad hard to get a world war to stay in power, not taking into it. And their whole ability to do that is depending solely upon the restraint of other countries. There is a certain point where restraint is not acceptable anymore, and those countries will do what they have to do, and we all die. And you really got to understand Chinese and really Russians, their culture is built on martyrdom. They didn't spend 39 million of their people in World War II being like Westerners. That was just natural for Russians. So, read Dostoevsky. People really should read Dostoevsky, read Tolstoy, really understand the Russian mind, really understand the Far Eastern mind, primarily the Chinese, Japanese, Korean, right? Understand the Far Eastern mind. We in the West, we don't understand. Now, I haven't spent time in Russia. I spent time in Japan. I spent time in Korea. I spent time in China. I thought I had studied the cultures and the languages. I thought I knew what I was. Yeah, I spent time there. I realized I didn't. Totally different mindset.
Taking it a little bit home as we wrap up to here in the U.S., several weeks ago, could I say a mutiny in Congress led by the historic ouster of the House Speaker, leaving the door open for governmental shutdown, which didn't quite happen for several weeks. I mean, we're doing a good enough job, I guess you could say, of destroying ourselves from within, possibly with outside forces fueling some of this, of course. Am I looking at it too linear? I mean, I'm assuming it's more complex, like you said, if there's multiple factions. But as we're heading into an election cycle and a new president being elected in about 12 and a half months, there's a lot going on. And what could we do to have an impact?
I don't think there's any chance for impact now. Now it's a matter of being intelligent enough and checking your ego enough and your pride enough and your gatekeepers enough to recognize that we are in a position that we've never been in before in the English-speaking world. That goes back over 1,000 years, 1,300 years. We've never been in this position before. Now, there are aspects of it that are similar, but everything's way beyond what it's ever been before. We are, when Ray Dalio and Bill Gates tell you that there's a very high chance of civil war in the United States within the next 10 years, and we're 2 or 3 years on from them saying that, we need to take that shit serious. If we can't get this, if factions within the administrative state can't get their world war, there's an extraordinarily high likelihood there will be a civil war. And we need to take that seriously.
Could I argue it's a cold civil war now?
It already is. That's exactly right. And back to the McCarthy, the Responsibles faction is finally coming together as a faction and functioning together. And that's what McCarthy's ouster was a warning to the administrative state, to the other two factions, that we are still in the game. We still know how to play. We're still quite capable. And we're willing to do the hard things, knowing that you're going to come after us in all kinds of direct and indirect ways. Now, here's the bigger problem there. One, you can't let the two resentfuls factions just run over you. But the moment you stand up, anybody who's been in a nasty divorce can tell you this from personal experience in a custody battle. The moment you stand up to those factions, I mean literally stand up, they are going to unleash hell on you, your family, your connections, your relationships, everything around you. But there comes a point where you have to stand up and you have to push back. And that's what's happening. That's where we are. Now, where it goes from there, when they feel, if and when either of those factions or one of those factions feels that they're genuinely losing power, that's when they'll unleash hell. And it's inescapable.
Wow. That
So
is
it either gets channelized externally while this fight goes on, cold, stays a cold fight, and all that rage and hot stuff goes overseas, or the both hot and cold stays here at home. And what it looks like with what's happening in the world geopolitically is China can step in and do real diplomacy, as the Russians can step in. Lavrov, there was all the praise of Kissinger, you love him or hate him, for some Lavrov's on Kissinger level. I mean, he's that figure now for our time. So this and the world is tired of war. People don't realize this at home. We've been in the GWOT since 2001, and we've been at war everywhere in the world. Both the 99% that's non-kinetic and the kinetic, and the world's tired, and it doesn't want it anymore. So all of that, it doesn't mean you can't get nasty people to do nasty stuff, right? You can always get nasty people in different places to do nasty stuff because they're factional conflicts as well. But for the most part, all of the world's leaders outside of the West are exhausted and don't want to fight anymore and have told us, no, you will not drive us to it, and we will not allow you to drive the rest of the world to it.
EM Burlingame, everyone. EM, for those that would like to inquire about your book, follow you on Twitter, and perhaps engage with you from a conversation and consultative perspective, how could they go about any or all three?
Yeah, so my name, EM, the two letters, Burlingame, at Twitter, and we can start there, or you can find me on LinkedIn. I don't go on LinkedIn very often, but I go on every few days. Or you can reach through Angelo and connect with me there, right?
And how about your book? Is that available on Amazon?
It's up on Amazon. The one I'd pay attention to right now is The Eternal War. I'm also writing a novel that goes into a lot of this stuff in far more detail and provides a lot more historical touch, but in an entertaining way. And you can find that on Medium and Substack. And it's called As Rome Burns. And I'm serializing it, so I'm adding about a chapter every week or 2 weeks.
Incredible. And in my close, everyone, this has been quite a live conversation. I love these. There's no editing. They're not polished up. They're a little rough around the edges, and I'll probably put it up as it is. I'm not looking for it to be overly polished per se. Like I did state earlier, these are interesting and topical and sensitive subjects. It's an opportunity to have a discussion, to open up your mind, perhaps from a different perspective. Agree or disagree, that really doesn't matter. Hopefully it was worth some of the thinking and reflection in your mind in the conversation. Of course, this is relative to opinions at this given time in mid-October of 2023. You may hear this in a week, a month, a year, and it's completely different. It's not necessarily evergreen, although you could argue aspects of it are. And again, it's meant for educational and entertainment purposes. What did I say earlier? At the end of the day, you need to think for yourself and you need to make your own decisions. Make sure that you're responsible for that. This is strictly for entertainment purposes. Everyone, I'm Angelo Robles of Family Office TV and, of course, Family Office Masterclass. This is a subject that I love. It is one of my 3 masterclasses, Sovereign Risk and Disaster Preparedness for Family Offices. EM is incredible and definitely one of my resources. And I literally have dozens, if not hundreds of others, broadly from legal, accounting, cyber, warfare issues, etc. So hopefully you did have a chance to enjoy it. Go to angelorobles.com. See all the amazing things within the Family of Wealth and Family Office community. Some of it that no one else is touching and no one else is doing. Become active in it. Become a part of it. Participate, join, get the value in our master classes. And these are programs from a consultative perspective that we also customize and put together as well. We hope you enjoyed today's conversation. Again, feel free to reach out anytime. I'm Angelo Robles, and thank you for watching at Family Office TV and Family Office Masterclass. And again, I could be reached on varying social media platforms. You'll find me. And of course, at Angelo Robles, ROBLES.com. EM, thank you so much.
Thank you, Angelo. Talk to you later,
Pleasure.
my friend.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.